Today, in 2024, 334 million people live in the United States. In 1962, that figure was 184 million. The Soviet bombers, submarines, and intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, during the Cuban Missile Crisis had the ability to kill 80 to 100 million Americans. In October 1962, American U-2 spy planes photographed ICBMs and MRBMs on the island of Cuba, posing a massive threat to the safety and security of the United States. For hours on end, every day, President John F. Kennedy sat in meetings with his State Department, Department of Defense, other members of his cabinet, the CIA, and his most trusted advisors. On October 22, 1962, the first meeting of the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, ExComm, was held. From that point on, ExComm argued, debated, and deliberated the best possible steps in solving the crisis. Despite their glorious reputation as JFK's inner circle who helped him bring the Cuban Missile Crisis to peace, though, ExComm was faulty, inconsistent, and in reality made the decision much harder for the president. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a 13-day period of hostilities between the Soviet Union and the United States, spanning from October 16th to October 29th, 1962. It was sparked by the Soviet Union placing nuclear weapons in Cuba that September. After the missiles were photographed and shown to the president on October 16th, everyone from the CIA to the Pentagon was on high alert. This is when ExComm came in. Kennedy believed that he needed the top political and military brains in his corner if he was going to be able to resolve the conflict. So on October 22nd, 16 men, including Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, John McCone, the Director of the CIA, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General and the little brother of John F. Kennedy, Llewellyn Thompson, the Ambassador to the Soviet Union, Dean Acheson, the former Secretary of State, General Maxwell Taylor, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and General Curtis LeMay, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, began the argument of what to do in order to make the Soviet Union back down. That same night, President Kennedy delivered his famous address to the nation and informed the citizens of the Soviet military buildup in Cuba.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Upon receiving the first preliminary hard information of this nature, last Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., I directed that our surveillance be stepped up.
During ExComm's meetings, President Kennedy was frequently advised to take immediate military action by sending airstrikes against the missile sites and to launch a surprise invasion of Cuba. This opinion was held by the likes of General Taylor, General LeMay, Dean Acheson, Llewellyn Thompson, and others. Secretary of Defense McNamara and Secretary of State Rusk felt differently. They believed that was rash and reckless, citing that an invasion of Cuba could lead to a Soviet invasion of Berlin. Eventually, after many brutal, fiery arguments involving attacks on members of the committee's families and even one member leaving in the middle of a meeting, President Kennedy reached the conclusion that the best course of action was a naval quarantine of Cuba. It was essentially a blockade, but it was called a quarantine due to the fact that a blockade was a direct act of war. During the quarantine, an offer from the Soviets was proposed in which the missiles would be removed from Cuba if in return the American PGM-19 Jupiter missiles in Turkey were removed. After some negotiation, it was decided that the Soviet missiles would be removed immediately, and then a few months later, the Jupiter missiles would be removed, so as to not seem like the United States lost the deal. On October 29th, the withdrawal began and the quarantine was lifted. One reason ExComm struggled was because it was basing its decision off of incorrect information. The CIA estimate of the battle-ready Soviet forces on Cuba was from 10 to 12,000. They were off by about 28,000 soldiers, and they also failed to pick up on the 35 battlefield nuclear 2K6 Luna missiles that would obliterate any American soldier as soon as they stepped foot on the island. Had President Kennedy taken the advice of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and carried out an invasion of Cuba, it would have gone 10 times worse than the Bay of Pigs. Members of XCOM also failed to let their egos go to the side when it came down to making the final decision on the correct course of action. Multiple times, General Curtis LeMay had requests to bomb Cuba denied by the president and was eaten alive by Robert McNamara on numerous occasions during meetings, but nonetheless he continued to plead for an invasion. Even after his term as Chief of Staff of the Air Force, LeMay is on record saying an invasion was the best option. While some members couldn't see any opinion other than theirs being correct, others just flat out refused to have an opinion. McGeorge Bundy, Kennedy's national security advisor, tended to just have the opinion that whatever the Joint Chiefs said is wrong. XCOM was not only stubborn and indecisive, they got nothing done at all, let alone in a timely fashion. While the world sat, watched, and waited as the two biggest nuclear superpowers butted heads, the men in charge of making sure the world didn't come to an end took their sweet time. XCOM held 44 meetings in total, 42 of which were without the president. In the end, it required President Kennedy to make a split-second decision to quarantine Cuba in order to avoid a third world war. The chiefs said full-scale invasion, Rusk questioned whether anything had to be done at all, McNamara believed that they should step up defense in Berlin, and this all meant that XCOM's bickering was just stalling any actual decision from becoming a reality.